Hello and welcome to the annual Gordon Sandison Memorial Lecture. My name is Amir Abedi. I'm the chair of the Political Science Department here at Western Washington University. I hope you can all hear me. If not, let me know. Good to see everyone. Let me start by acknowledging that Western Washington University's main campus is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin all throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. We express our deepest respect and gratitude to our indigenous neighbors for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. I also want to thank the Sandison family, whose initial gift made this annual event possible. And I want to talk a little bit about Gordon Sandison because most people may not be aware. He was born in 1919 in Auburn, here in Washington, and he served in the Marine Corps during World War II. And after the war, he was initially elected to the Washington State House of Representatives, where he served about 11 years. And then he switched and became a state senator until 1977, when he was appointed the director of Washington's Department of Fisheries. In 1977, President Carter also appointed him a member of the International Pacific Salmon Fisheries Commission. He passed on October 27th, 1989, and I want to acknowledge that his son Trevor and his grandson William are joining us today. We're very grateful for that, and they're attending both remotely and in person. So thank you to all of you who are in the auditorium today, as well as those who are joining us via Zoom remotely. I would also like to thank for their support and partnership, both financially and otherwise, the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, especially Dean Paredes and Associate Dean Geisler, the Western Washington University Alumni Association, in particular Janine Bengtson for all her help, the members of the Department of Political Sciences PSA Conference Committee, and here I'm particularly talking about Professors Melina Juarez, Deborah Salazar, and Michael Wolf. I also want to thank the members of the Political Science Association and its president, Sarah Tack, as well as the faculty advisor, Professor Kathy Weininger. And also our department manager, Erica Steele, without whom this event would not be possible. So thank you to everybody. I also want to acknowledge our now retired colleague, Maury Froese, attending. And it's now my pleasure to invite my colleague, Professor Kate Dessler, to introduce this year's Sandison lecturer, Professor Jake Grumbach. Kate.
Thank you very much. Sound is working. It's not.
Come on.
And if you
speak just near me, then everybody can hear you online.
Welcome, folks. My name is Kate Dessler. I'm in the Political Science Department, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Jake Grumbach today, an assistant professor of political science at the University of Washington. Jake's award-winning scholarly work taps into core questions about race, class, and American institutions, with an underlying focus on how elections and other social and political systems, including labor unions, enhance or undermine the functioning of an interracial democracy. Professor Grumbach holds a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and held a postdoctoral fellowship at Princeton Center for the Study of Democratic Politics. At UW, he's affiliated not only with the Political Science Department, but also for the Harry Bridge Center for Labor Studies. His recent book, Laboratories Against Democracy, highlights the ways in which national political party dynamics have simultaneously raised the stakes of state elections and undermined their responsiveness to state-specific populations and preferences. I'm very excited to hear his talk today, titled Understanding the Democratic Crisis. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that generous introduction. I hope I'm going to project. I'll actually demask for the talk. It is So wonderful to be here. I want to echo the thanks to the Sandison family. Thanks to Erica Steele again for organizing a tremendous conference. Thanks to the Department of Political Science. It's been a tremendous experience already getting to know this department, a bit about the university, visit Bellingham. It's just an outstanding trip. And so thank you all for taking the time out of what is a ridiculously gorgeous day to talk about a less sunny topic. My talk today is understanding the democratic crisis. And let me make sure I'm working. So the sort of motivation for this talk and this line of research is the ongoing crisis of American democracy. And we saw a manifestation, an explosive one, of this crisis on January 6th, 2021, with the insurrection at the US Capitol. And there's been a tremendous amount of focus on this crisis of American democracy, but this focus has really been zoomed in and zeroed in on Washington, DC, and institutions in the federal government, particularly the executive branch of the federal government, as well as on January 6th, Congress, and so forth. But the US constitutional system actually puts democratic institutions and their administration, so election administration, districting, policing powers, the ability to count votes or not count votes at the state level constitutionally. So my line of work is really arguing that to understand this ongoing crisis of American democracy, we have to look to the state level. So roadmap of what I'm gonna be discussing today. So one part of my work is really measuring systematically the quality of state level democracy in the US going back recent decades. So I call this new measure of state level democracy the State Democracy Index, and we're going to do a tiny bit of math today, but I'll make it fun. Second, we're going to investigate what is causing the expansion of democracy in some states and the contraction of democracy in others. And we're going to look into longstanding theories from social science, political philosophy, history, sociology, economics, and elsewhere to think about theories of partisan competition or partisan polarization, theories of racial threat and racial backlash to demographic change, and theories based in sort of the group composition of today's national Republican Party. And I say national, this is going to come up. The collision of national groups with state level subnational institutions is going to play a role throughout this talk. And then I'm going to conclude with some potential solutions from social science that point us to where we may get out of this crisis, knock on wood. Those solutions I'm going to be talking about sort of potential for democracy reforms, institutional reforms of the US Constitution, as well as reinvigorating the labor movement and its role in sort of multiracial democracy. So the sort of empirical statistical pattern I'm going to be talking about a lot is this. So here what you see is my state level democracy measure. So lower scores are more restrictive democracy, higher scores more expansive democracy, going back to 2000 here. And states are separated, states controlled by unified democratic governments where the state legislature, both chambers are controlled by Democrats and the governorship. In green, divided states, states that have a governor and state legislative chambers of different parties, and the red states, the unified Republican state governments. And what you see now is a divergence between these groups of states in their democratic performance, and we're going to investigate why. So overall, sort of moving back, I mentioned that the US Constitution is extremely decentralized and puts extremely important authorities at the state level. This is different than even other countries that have federal structures, multi-level governance. So federalism means you have at least two levels of government that have constitutional authority that can't be encroached upon by the other. In the US, actually, local governments have no constitutional authority. They're created by state governments, and state governments can abolish them if they wanted. They tend not to because that would be really unpopular. But in other countries that have federal systems, Germany, Switzerland, Canada, Mexico, India, right? Tremendous number of federal institutional systems, but none put so much authority over democratic institutions at the lower level unit, okay? Given that, we really have to focus on these lower level units to understand American democracy. And historically, there's been a pattern that you all know of, which has been that state and local governments have either de facto or de jure by law, enforced white supremacy, and it's been usually civil rights activists calling on the national government to step in to stop state and local, be it slavery laws, segregation, other sort of restrictions on democracy. But the actual conventional wisdom is the opposite. The conventional wisdom is that lower level decentralization in the US Constitution is really advantageous for democracy. So states in the conventional social science wisdom and sort of punditry, and we hear this increasingly. I'm going to talk about some sort of recent pundit takes in the Trump era about institutional decentralization in the US, is that this is really helpful for democratic performance. So going through a few of those theories, one of those theories, going back to James Madison and the Federalist Papers, is that decentralization brings those elected officials closer to their constituents, right? You hear this in campaigns all the time, like, unlike those distant fat cats in DC, I'm your state legislator or whatnot, right? This legal scholar, Beer, argues that this brings a more closely and actively joined voter and representative, as opposed to having just a national unitary government the way most countries, most democracies around the world have it. Another is that decentralization reduces national conflict and polarization, right? This is actually a theory. You saw some recent op-eds about the overturning of Roe v. Wade. If we return reproductive rights only to the states, then people can move. You can go to a conservative religious state like Kansas, not have abortion rights if you want. You can move to, California or Washington states if you do want reproductive rights. Then everybody can get along and move to the place where their values are reflected in policy, right? This reduces national conflict. Jonathan Rauch argued this would be true about same-sex marriage for many years, right? That if we left this up to the states, states can customize, we'll all stop all this sort of negative polarization nationally. Another is that, aligned with this, is that you, beyond just your vote at the state or local level, you can vote with your feet and just move to a place that has the tax policies you like, the policies around trans rights and climate policies that you may like, right? And at the international level, that's more difficult, right? It's harder to move countries, get a new set of citizenship, right? To move to a place where your policies are reflected. In addition, there's been this argument going back to Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis that states can act as policy laboratories and innovate and create new policy experiments. And then the good policy experiments can be emulated, copied by other states. States overall are going to produce better governance by learning from each other. And wouldn't it be a shame, the argument goes, if we only had one laboratory of democracy, the national government, and we couldn't do all this experimentation? And lastly, going again back to the Federalist Papers of James Madison, 1788, the idea of double security. If you have a would-be autocrat seeking national power, it's harder for them to capture every state level election administration or state level government, right? We saw this to some extent in the Trump administration when sort of coastal democratically controlled states said, I'm not going to let the Trump administration come and encroach with authoritarian sort of policies in our state, right? And you see this in sort of popular punditry all the time. So here, David Brooks writes, federal power is impersonal, uniform, abstract, and rule-oriented. Local power is personalistic, relational, affectionate, irregular, and based on a shared history of reciprocity and trust. And here on the right side of the slide is a book from 2017 by a sort of pundit social theorist Yuval Levin, The Fractured Republic, which really takes a hardcore argument of that depolarization. If we move more policies to the state and local level, take them out of conflict in Washington, D.C., we'll all get along. We'll stop this, polling results that people don't want their children marrying somebody from the other party. We'll all get along if we can just devolve things to the state and local level. Those were sort of center-right theorists, right? But there's also sort of center-left and progressive versions of this decentralization theory. So right now, the dean of Yale Law School is Heather Gerken, and she created this theory called progressive federalism. And she argues that decentralization has really helped new immigrant groups, Black Americans, Native Americans through, in the post-civil rights period, she argues, places that can construct majority minority localities, for example, or states that are becoming majority minority. then racial minority groups can have the voting numbers to get descriptive representation. They can vote in members of their own racial groups to state and local power in ways that are empowering for these communities, right? So she's arguing decentralization is advantageous for civil rights in the sort of post-1960s period. But I'm sort of reinvigorating what I'd say is a set of counter theories where decentralization is disadvantageous for democratic performance in the US, especially with respect to multiracial democracy. And this line of theory takes a few forms. So one is going back to that pattern I mentioned of civil rights activists throughout American history calling on the national government to step in to enforce civil rights against states and localities. So W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the original sort of American social scientists, in his book, Black Reconstruction, writes about Reconstruction and sort of notes this pattern, I think for the first time in a social science framework, that actually the legacy of racial justice for Black Americans has been calling on the national government to enforce civil rights, be it under slavery and then later Jim Crow, and now to some extent with respect to racially authoritarian policing and other issues. And then there's this political economist who is in an econ department in the 1960s. He became a famous economist. His name was William Riker, and by law, I have to make the joke that that's also the name of the first in command of the USS Enterprise in Star Trek: The Next Generation, but they're different people. The political economist William Riker wrote, and he was absolutely no radical. He was as mainstream game theory econ as it gets. And he concluded in his book entitled Federalism, which was kind of a, became lost to the sands of time, is now being sort of reinvigorated, but his key quote is, if one disapproves of racism, one should disapprove of federalism. All that federalism ever did was to facilitate the expression of racist beliefs and the perpetuation of racist acts. And when I read that, I was like, this is astounding. In addition, so in contrast to the Madison idea of double security, right, that decentralization protects us against autocracy and a national takeover of a tyrant, it actually may be the case that decentralization and allowing election administration, districting, and so forth to be done at these lower levels can actually empower anti-democratic coalitions to capture a few of those beachheads. And because states regulate elections from local dog catcher up to president, something like voter suppression in a state, in a swing state, or now election subversion, a state legislator deciding we don't want to give the electoral college vote to the presidential candidate that won our state's electorate, that is technically constitutionally legal. And this is allowed for by institutional decentralization. If you capture a state like North Carolina or Wisconsin, that affects representation at all levels and can make it more likely that an autocrat takes national power in the first place. I would say, though, if you have an autocrat or a would-be autocrat in national power, you probably don't want to centralize election administration right then, right? But over the long term, it makes it more likely potentially that we get that would-be autocrat taking national power. In addition, I'll go through this a little bit at the end of the talk, but in my book, I really try to expound upon at lower levels, in contrast to the theories of, state level, now we're bringing representatives closer to the constituents, right? They're gonna have their ear to the ground, right? Really listen to constituent concerns. Actually, lower levels of government are especially advantageous for groups with money. Money travels farther in local government and state government. There's also greater, what's called information asymmetry between powerful groups with money and ordinary voters. It's very hard to track what's going on in state government, but we all know what's going on in national government to some extent. We know which presidential candidates we vote for in primaries and so forth. But even myself, PhD in political science, I think I'm decent at political science, don't quite know how to vote in state legislative primaries when I, moved to Seattle, for example, right? That is a serious issue. And then finally, groups that are able to be mobile with political resources send money to key states, right? If a state changes its state legislative party majority, right? A group that can move money and pass a lot of policies has advantages over ordinary voters, over social movements, over groups of workers, people that are not as, whose political power is in themselves and their vote and are not able to move as quickly geographically, okay? But so we have these sort of competing theories of decentralization and federalism. Are states going to be democratic champions or democratic villains? But we don't really have systematic quantitative measurement, and to some extent we don't have systematic qualitative measurement to really get overall what are states doing with respect to democracy. But you all know, and you came to this talk, I'm sure you've seen the news over the past decade or so of what states have been doing with respect to democracy. Really key moves have been made from state governments on issues of voter suppression, gerrymandering, and to some extent, even the potential for what's called election subversion, saying no matter who our state votes for, we can award, for example, electoral college votes or even the governorship to whoever we, the state legislature, wants. And if you're a gerrymandered state legislature that can win a majority of your state legislature with maybe 35 or 40% of the state's popular vote, right? That is not an especially democratic system. So what I'm going to do here is try to systematically measure dynamics in state level democracy over the past 2 decades. Okay. And what I do there is there's actually huge interest in political science and comparative politics, which is, I'm an Americanist. I'm a, sort of parochial one country focus, right? But the best subfield out there is comparative politics. They compare political economies and political systems and political behavior around the world. And there's a huge interest in measuring the quality of countries' democracy, right? Cross-national measurement of democracy. And they've really pointed out Hungary, the Philippines, Brazil, we've seen democratic backsliding in a number of countries recently, right? So I take a sort of page out of that book and I say, we should apply this type of methodology to the US states where we don't have this kind of measurement. But in the US states, because democratic institutions are at this lower level, you cannot know enough or understand threats to American democracy by just looking at sort of the average across all states, right? You have to look at the state level. But democracy is such a big concept, right? We all have slightly different definitions of it. It's democratic theory and philosophy is one of the biggest sort of wings of philosophy and political philosophy going back to ancient Greece and before, right? This is a big concept. So to get sort of analytical traction on measuring democracy, one thing the comparativists do, and I sort of copy, is to break it down into different components. There's electoral democracy. Do you have free and fair and secure elections, right? That sort of give majorities of voters what they want. Then you have liberal democracy, which is really important right now, right? Civil rights and liberties as well is another component. Be that, there are different definitions, but I would say something like reproductive rights and the right of women to be equal members of the polity, right, of the political system, economically, socially, and politically and civically in that way is a component of liberal democracy, but also, freedom from state-based authoritarianism when it comes to something like the police state or mass incarceration. And then also the comparativists are really amazing where as an Americanist, like I never thought it was possible to say this, but the comparativists have theories of social democracy where egalitarian sort of material equality is part of a definition of egalitarian democracy. And in grad school, like when you're a quantitative Americanist, like that's not allowed. But here, that's another component. So what I do is I measure democratic performance on all these components, but I'm really gonna focus on the electoral democracy component for this talk. That's for whatever reason that's gotten, I think, the most buzz, but I'd be happy to talk more broadly about the trends in the other components as well. So to measure democracy on these components, I then collect indicators of each component, individual variables that are sort of proxies for those components. So I just mentioned, for example, like reproductive rights, some sort of measure, indicator of that could go into the liberal democracy component. Maybe something like economic inequality or something could go in the egalitarian one. I have 116 of those variables, those indicators so far, continuing to collect relevant indicators. 51 of those are in that electoral democracy component. So I'm really going to focus on that today, okay? Some statistics for you, they come in different forms. You can have a binary variable. Does a state have same-day voter registration or not? Or does it have no fault absentee and mail balloting systems. It can be a continuous variable like a measure of bias in their districting and gerrymandering, right? So some examples of this are, measures of gerrymandering, like the partisan efficiency gap is a measure of gerrymandering, how much one party advantages itself in its drawing of districts. Same-day voter registration. You can have something like state protections for journalists' anonymous sources not being revealed to the state by coercion. Or you can have something like a measure of economic inequality, like the Gini coefficient, or other, you can do really all sorts of measures of economic inequality, the 99 to 1 ratio, for example, in the distribution of wealth or income. And these aggregate up here, you see into, one could create a giant state democracy index, but again, I'm focusing on this electoral democracy component here, and we'll talk about it more. And now, just to show how annoying this data collection was, I'm just gonna show all the variables really quick in small font, so you go like, wow, that looks like a lot of work, but we can talk about the individual indicators if we want later. But these bolded indicators are the electoral democracy indicators. We can come back to this with more time. So what I do is I put these indicators into what's called a measurement model. So I'm not saying that, I think voter ID laws are worth 5 points, and same-day registration is worth 8 points, and automatic voter registration is 12 points, and 1 point for like ballots rejected from overseas, voting, and 5 points for gerrymandering. I'm letting a statistical model determine how to weight those indicators. Okay. So we can talk about this if you're interested, but this is trying to do a data-driven measure. So it's not my particular, sort of beliefs and normative philosophies about how to weight these things. I'm saying, let's let the model determine this measure, and then we can do other checks to see if we create different styles of democracy measures to see if these results end up holding. But you'll see what this model tells me is that a policy like no-fault absentee voting here, where anybody, regardless of their health or disability or age status, can get an absentee mail ballot, that has a positive effect on a state's democracy score. That's what the model tells me. Having a post-election audit required, right? Something about election security, where after an election, there's an audit of the vote count. That's also positive for a state's democracy score. Same with early voting. But then you get things that are negative for a state's democracy score. And these are, these are the calculations that the model comes up with. And it tells me that felon disenfranchisement laws, where ex-felons or this is an ordinal variable. One state, Vermont, allows those in prison to vote. Other states reject all ex-felons can never vote again. Some states have some ex-felons are not allowed to vote for violent or sexual crimes, and other states allow everyone to vote. And having felon disenfranchisement laws has a negative effect on a state's democracy score. Same thing with the average wait time to vote in person. That's collected by the MIT Election Lab, which does great data collection work, and they use smartphone data to track on average how much everybody in the country waits to vote. And it varies tremendously across states and within states based on, some variables you probably guessed, how urban and rural, how high income, and essentially how Black and Latino the areas are, right? Finally, the gerrymandering measures like the efficiency gap, the more you have an efficiency gap between the parties, the more biased your districts are, that has a strong negative effect on your state's democracy score, okay? So that's what the model is telling me to create this measure out of, these indicators. And once you create the measure, you can look at what's going on with states' overall levels of democracy in this quantitative way. So here I'm picking out some key state cases. So here, this dotted line at the top is Washington State. Let's go team. We're doing relatively well. So you see Washington State's democracy score starts out very strong and gets a bit stronger over time as Washington State has allowed automatic voter registration, full all-mail voting, where you can also drop your ballot off in person or put it in the mail, right? Like Colorado as well, a leader in this. As well as before had same day registration where you could, if you didn't register to vote before the deadline, you could show up at the polling place, register and do a provisional ballot there, and then they'd check. And if it turns out you're eligible to vote and you're a resident, then that ballot that you cast does count. Those were leading policies. It also has very fair districting, right? Across the parties. It's now a state controlled by a single political party in the legislature and governorship, but it draws consistently pretty fair districts. It's fair to both parties in that one party's votes out in the mass public doesn't count more towards a majority in the legislature than the other parties, okay? Then you have some other states like Texas here in the dashed line, sort of at the bottom. It starts around a little below the average. And over time, there's some fluctuations across this time period. It gets, a little bit more restrictive in Texas, and there's some gerrymandering, but overall it ends again a bit below average by 2020. And then you get a set of states that really transform over this time period. Here in the solid line, you see North Carolina, one of those example states. It starts out as a relative leader in its democratic performance. And in the 1990s, North Carolina is a fascinating story. North Carolina's Jim Crow regime was one of the longest to break down, took through the 1970s to really remove Jim Crow voting laws in practice. But by the 1990s, it was a real success story in implementing the National Motor Voter Act that gave states funds to register people at DMVs. It's becoming a more competitive state. Youth voting is skyrocketing. The racial gap in voter turnout is diminishing. More people are getting registered to vote. It's a real success story through the 2000s. But then following 2010, North Carolina's democratic quality, according to this measure, falls off a cliff. And we'll talk about, and it becomes one of the poorest democratic outcomes over this time period. And North Carolina, relatively purple state in its sort of elections, right? In 2008, voted for Obama in the presidential election. More recently, majorities voted for Donald Trump in the recent presidential election. But overall, we're going to investigate why some states are really dramatically changing their democratic performance over this time period. And that's what we're going to turn to next. What are some theories for why states are changing their democratic performance over this time period in sort of positive or negative directions? So let's go back to sort of the history of political science and political economy and sociology and social sciences in the US and how we understand why democracies around the world might expand or contract. One line of theory is in partisan competition. This theory says, on the one hand, when parties are really competitive and the Democratic and Republican parties are really fighting it out and it's really close in elections, right? And each party's looking for an advantage over the other. This can actually be really positive for democracy. Don Thiel wrote a book on the women's franchise, which started state by state before the constitutional amendment allowing women to vote. And she argues that states where the Democratic and Republican parties were competing around the turn of the century, both parties were looking for new constituencies to bring in to win. So whichever party could compete to get women into the political system and win women's votes at that time period, those were the parties that then supported enfranchising women, right? So that was positive for democracy. On the other hand, more recently, Francis Lee would argue that actually really close elections and narrow majorities in legislatures, that promotes brinksmanship and real conflict, right? The opposite style of theory, right? The closer the elections, right? Or the closer the narrow majorities in Congress or state legislature, then you have every incentive to not let the other party get one more seat. So you might break the rules to avoid that, right? So it's sort of an open question. Will competition be good or bad for democracy? A second theory is pretty simple. Polarization, the distance in the sort of goals and agendas between the Democratic and Republican parties. In a state that's very polarized, where Democrats and Republicans don't see eye to eye on policy goals, it's pretty simple. The more distant you are from the other party, the more you don't want that other party to take power, right? If you're actually pretty similar, right? If you're thinking like the 1950s, like Eisenhower, Truman, or like some, there's real like moderates in both parties, and the moderates don't super care if the other party takes power, right? It's not going to change policy all that much. It's different when the parties are very distant, right? Ziblatt and Levitsky in their book, How Democracies Die, an outstanding comparative politics book published at a really important time. They also argue that polarization really erodes those elite norms, right, in parliaments around the world. Then there's another theory of demographic change and racial threat, right? So a huge amount of social science across disciplines shows that when there's a new influx of a new ethnic or racial group, especially to a local area, right? There's a famous study, for example, that when a researcher did an experiment in Massachusetts on trains, showing that if he specifically told about a dozen Spanish-speaking Latino people to go on to trains, and then he surveyed all the other people on these trains, some of which were randomly assigned to have these Spanish-speaking Latinos on them for an hour, others not. The sort of native-born population around these Spanish-speaking Latinos reported more anti-immigration and anti-democratic attitudes. So that's a common finding in local politics and in general, that demographic change may provoke a backlash, right? And say, you know, we're becoming a group minority within a society. We should pull up the ladder and sort of make democratic institutions more restrictive so we don't lose our sort of status in a hierarchy, right? That's a common thing. So here I'm going to ask, does demographic change, particularly rapid demographic change in a state, reduce a state's democratic performance? And finally, there's a theory focused more on the National Republican Party in practice. This theory builds on some others, but it shows that the Republican Party currently, its groups in its coalition, if you had to summarize them, one is the sort of business wing that has set the economic policy agenda of the Republican Party. If we remember, Donald Trump campaigned on some sort of economic populism, but in practice, the two major policies they brought up to a congressional vote during that time was high-end tax cut and repealing the Affordable Care Act, right? Were the two major policies, not exactly the sort of like white working class like policies you might have expected from the rhetoric in the campaign, right? So you have that constituency in the Republican Party. And then you also have the voter base that is clearly, this is statistically demonstrated over and over, it's like clearly motivated by the culture war, right? Both of those constituencies are not going to have the most incentive or interest to have an expansive democracy, right? So maybe control by the Republican Party in states is going to drive democratic backsliding and democratic change over this time period. So let's see some stats. So what I'm going to do in the next few statistical slides is I'm going to show the results. Which of these theories appears to be empirically accurate, right? And I'm going to do that with a set of statistical models that looks at change within states. So we're not comparing Washington State to Mississippi, right? We're comparing Washington State in earlier periods to Washington State in later periods, and separately Mississippi in early periods to Mississippi in later periods, right? It's not, there's too many differences between states to really say, like, we're going to compare the average of California to the average of Louisiana, all right? So here, I'm just going to show the sort of higher values. You don't need to worry too much about what's on these axes. But here, every time I'm going to show a dashed line at 0 with higher values showing a greater positive effect on state level democracy, lower values a negative effect. And here what we're finding, just to summarize, we can come back to this, modestly positive results for competition, all right? So partisan competitions, when there's close elections, narrow majorities in state legislatures, modestly positive, but not a big effect, okay? This is not a main driver of anything, but it's certainly not negative, I would conclude. Polarization, an extremely precisely estimated 0, right on the line. There is no effect of polarization within a state. As a state's legislature or its voters get more polarized, so within North Carolina, as North Carolina Democrats and Republicans stop agreeing as much, that's not what's driving it either. How about demographic change and racial threat within states? Well, here I'm highlighting in these plots, and we can do the statistical model later if we want, but here I'm highlighting the main Democratic backsliding states: Alabama, North Carolina, Tennessee, Ohio, Wisconsin, and I'm showing their change in Black population and Latino population over this time period. And if you look especially at this Latino population slide, what you should conclude is these are not rapidly diversifying states. You know, North Carolina, yeah, it goes from like maybe 5% to 8% Latino over 20 years, you know. I'm not sure that's quite enough to really explain this, you know, major democratic backsliding we saw in North Carolina earlier, right? However, I don't want to say that race is not central to democratic conflict and backsliding in the US though, right? But as I mentioned very early on, I was talking about national groups. This suggests to me that racial conflict is highly national at this point in American politics and is driving national parties' agendas, and votes people's votes are predicted by national racial conflict and trends. But within a state, it's not this demographic change at this localized level I talked about that's driving this democratic backsliding, okay? And we can see this more broadly, right? So there's no real effect of demographic change. And we can think about the, you know, moves on critical race theory we've seen recently, where these are people engaged in, you know, a sort of panic about critical race theory and sort of issues of race happening. Critical race theory backlashes are not happening in places experiencing a rapid increase of critical race theory, right? It's not a local dynamic, it is a national dynamic playing out through these subnational institutions, and I'll come back to that later. But really, no matter which way you slice it, and later I'll try to show you, no matter which way you measure democracy, right? You might think my weighting of democracy wasn't right, that the statistical model made, and we can weight it however we want, basically. But this is really about Republican control. Here on the right, you see, this is in standard deviations here. So when a state becomes unified Republican relative to the states that are either divided or democratically controlled here, it experiences a large reduction in its democratic performance. It's really substantial. This is over half a standard deviation decline in democratic performance. And if you know some like basic stats, what that standard deviation means, right? That is a large shift, right? So going back before, right? You know, very few states are beyond 1 or 2 standard deviations from each other. So this is a big movement when a state becomes Republican. And you can do this. So again, as I mentioned, you can make the measure however you want. Here I simulated 100,000 different measures with random weights. I said, you know, some people say, Jake, I don't like how you know, I don't think like felon disenfranchisement laws should be in the measure at all. Right? Or people have other ways of defining democracy. So what I do is I take all those indicators and I randomly assign them different weights, and then I run the stats model to test my theories again. And what you see is no matter what you do across all these measures, the effect of Republican control stays like quite negative. And the other ones don't move all that much, right? So let's summarize this for a second. And I want to make sure to get plenty of time for Q&A. But overall, little role for competition, but maybe a little bit, modestly positive, right? No role for polarization within states or demographic change within states on their own, right? Republican controlled state government really is leading to democratic decline in these states. But I want to say an exception is in the liberal democracy component I mentioned before. And if you really take a focus on policing and incarceration as an issue here, like state incarceration rates, inequality in incarceration rates, you know, issues of police violence, things like that, then it looks actually much more bipartisan, remarkably. In that electoral democracy component, we see Republican control is really driving this, but when it comes to sort of, I guess, civil liberties and freedom from state-based authoritarianism, it looks much more bipartisan. That was somewhat a surprise to me, but has been a finding in some of my earlier work on state public policy, that the tough on crime eras of the 70s and 90s, and we're in a new sort of return to a tough on crime period, it's quite bipartisan. That's reflected in some other work by, if you read people like Naomi Murakawa or Veshla Weaver and others on mass incarceration in the US. But let's get to some, I didn't give myself enough time for the solution, so feel free, we can sort of end and start Q&A, but I think there's a couple of key ways that this state level crisis can be redirected. One is national democracy reforms. So these institutional reforms, some of which there was some attention in the press to them in early 2021. But again, because states have constitutional authority over elections, districting, election counting, police powers, and incarceration, and so forth, right? National policy can set standards and set floors for all of these policies at the state level and say, states, you all have to automatically register all your residents to vote. You have to draw fair, we can ban gerrymandering quite easily, right? And say, if a state's districts are this biased, then Congress or an independent agency will just redraw the districts to make them fair. That's a very normal procedure, and that happens in almost every other democracy that has national authority over these democratic institutions. The Electoral Count Act is an old policy from the early 19th century about counting presidential votes in the Electoral College. That clearly needs reform as state legislatures are moving to innovate these election subversion policies. A second solution that I think is less, so these ones I think are relatively obvious, but another one that comes out of my research that's maybe less obvious is reviving the labor movement. So we know, first, huge amount of economics research has said, look, the sort of record-setting rise of inequality in the US since the 1970s, the decline of labor unions, or put other way, like the destruction of labor unions, has really let that trend really precipitously increase. So we know that labor unions increase wages across the board. We know that labor unions reduce inequality between workers overall, and also racial inequality and gender inequality. When they restricted public sector labor unions in Wisconsin, a great economics paper by Barbara Biasi, if you're curious, shows that teachers' wages, suddenly there's a huge gender gap in teachers' wages right after they restricted collective bargaining in Wisconsin. So we know all this about various forms of material equality, but how about electoral democracy? What does labor have anything to do with that? And my work with co-author Paul Freimer from Princeton really shows quantitatively and causally that union membership reduces racial resentment among white workers. So as the white working class has moved away from economic voting, right, towards culture war voting, so a true fact about political science polling and political psychology right now is, if you want to know about how someone votes, a better question that is more predictive of how they vote is not, what do they think about universal health care or the minimum wage or climate change? None of these. It's actually, if you ask them, like, what do you think about Colin Kaepernick? Or what do you think about Lil Nas X at the Country Music Awards? Like, those are actually statistically more predictive of somebody's vote choice than any sort of actual public policy out there, right? That change is really driven by the decline of labor unions. So we find, this is not comparing apples to oranges. We're saying we're tracking people and their racial resentment, white workers' racial resentment over their lifetimes. And then when they join a union, or a union essentially joins them, right? What happens to their racial resentment? And relative to the people who did not join a union, their racial resentment is lower. And racial resentment has been increasing among the white working class, but for the union members, it has been more stable. And with respect to multiracial democracy, this is really crucial. Labor unions have the potential to move policy, or move sort of political orientations out of the culture war back towards sort of common ground issues where multiracial groups of workers can have identities beyond sort of racial and gender and culture war identities, of solidaristic identities where we're pulling in the same direction for material public or public policy outcomes that can actually be done with policy rather than various forms of sort of cultural resentment and voting for the person who will talk trash about the right people on TV, right? So one of my favorite quotes ever is from Martin Luther King in his 1962 letter to the Amalgamated Laundry Workers in Tennessee, union that was on strike. And he writes in this letter, saying, like, keep going with this great strike, guys. He says, the coalition that can have the greatest impact in the struggle for human dignity here in America is that of the Negro and the forces of labor, because their fortunes are so closely intertwined. So I think, again, labor unions, not just inequality with respect to material and economic outcomes, right, but really critical for democracy and a country that has a resentful sort of the I guess, top of the racial and gender hierarchy that is struggling economically and produces a resentment-based politics. This is key to sort of democratic backsliding around the world throughout history. So here's my book, Laboratories Against Democracy, which takes up these and some other themes, but really the key thing here that I just want to focus on is we have to look at the state level for understanding what's going on in American democracy. And the irony here is that as politics has become more national, right? As we focus more on national politics and as the parties become more national and national in orientation and cultural conflict, the irony is that the states become more important. When a state changes which party controls it, it's going to dramatically change its policy. And it's really dangerous for American democracy because democratic institutions are constitutionally located at that level. All right. Thanks so much. Looking forward to some Q&A. Go Warriors. We're having a great but tough playoff series. Thank you. I'll stop screen sharing now. Oh yeah, cool. Thank you. I think this one, you can talk into the lapel mic.
You can kind of hear it. Can y'all hear me? Okay, awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Professor. So we're going to prioritize student questions. So if we have any here now, maybe we can start with that. If not, I believe there's some in the chat. We also have some that were sent in beforehand as well. Yeah.
I have a question about,
Oh,
I'm still not confused how this democratic index is arrived at. You, for example, voter ID, do you say this is good or bad and then it weights it, or do you say that the formula somehow determine if voter ID is in trouble and needs to get affected?
Really nicely done. If you want to see an extra slide of the actual equation of it, so you're exactly right. The model chooses the direction, right? Whether it's good or bad, and then it's weighting sort of how good or bad, right? Is this for a state score? So what you have to do technically, so, you know, real in a Bayesian model, you have to constrain the parameter space by setting at least one policy's direction. So what I do is I say automatic voter registration is good for democracy. That's the one imposition I make. The rest falls out from the statistical model. So the rest is about the relationships between the variables in the observed data. So it says, this is the technical question it asks. It says, what single state score for a state year best predicts the actual pattern of those democratic indicators that it has in that year? Does that make sense? So it's like any kind of regression model where it says, a regression model says what single coefficient for a variable is going to best predict the Y observed outcomes. This is going to say what single score predicts the matrix of observed democratic indicators in that state year. Does that make a little sense?
I guess I'm still a little confused. If tomorrow you realize, say tomorrow you decide that state ID is actually super great for democracy, is that something that the formula, I'm not sure what the right is in one kind of statements. It seems that
Yeah.
the formula will decide.
So, oh yeah, so I like that. So I would say, yeah, a better gold standard is to impose your own expert normative judgment on these, and that I do. So, you know, I do that and weight them all equally in some models, all the indicators equally as a first cut. But I think one thing I do, so I love in modern social science, you put all your replication data online and the code is there. And I say, you know, in those simulated democracy measures, going back to, let me quickly go back to that simulated democracy measure slide here. And I'll share that real quick. But here, this is 100,000 different weighting schemes, right? So I'm saying whatever your particular normative judgment about how to weight things, it's in one of these models. Literally every combination essentially of weighting schemes is in one of these in these distributions here. And no matter what weighting scheme you have, like the findings will remain. But I say I invite you and really any scholar to say, okay, I have this particular weighting scheme based on my expertise about voting rights or gerrymandering, right? Or in liberal or egalitarian democracy, and I'm imposing these weights, and then I'll create that measure, right? And my data is there available for you. And then you run these models and see what, like that is actually, I agree. Like But I think one way researchers often do this in constructing a measure of ideology, if you've seen, for example, in Congress, you see measures out there, DW nominate, a measure of how conservative is a given legislator in Congress over time. That's the exact same model as this in practice, right? It doesn't say, oh, this vote on the PRO Act or whatever is like liberal or conservative. It lets the data, the relationships between the patterns of votes, weight the different roll call votes in Congress, right, to create that measure. So that gives us some distance to say, we didn't impose our normative priors on this, but I think you're right, actually. Like, I would say a better standard is experts in the field, qualitative experts should determine these weightings in practice. Like, I think that is better. So that's a really excellent question. Oh yeah, sorry about
Oh,
that.
people can't hear it.
Oh, no.
No, they can't.
Oh, good.
Oh, the question.
Oh yeah, my bad. I'll repeat the question better next time. Yeah, I'll do that. Sure. But,
This person right here.
Oh, I actually, I think he answered my question.
I'm just gonna run away.
nice.
Oh, it's been a while since I've spoken into a mic. Hello. So my name's Fidelito, by the way. Hi, y'all. So I had like a question as far as like your two solutions that you brought up. So the first, well, I have two questions. The first question that I have is like kind of speaking to how likely you see like these national democracy reforms and this kind of revival of the labor movement happening. And then and kind of what steps you think it would take for both of these things to happen. And then the second kind of arm of my question is thinking about like, so this talk that you gave today, is there kind of like some resources that people can look at that are a bit more like accessible as far as language goes? Like, you know, speaking to a 5-year-old, explaining what you just said and where to go for that.
Absolutely. Fidelito asks first, what is the likelihood of these solutions coming to be in terms of national democracy, institutional reforms, and national labor reforms, or a reinvigoration of the labor movement? And another is like, what are some accessible resources on these topics? And that I would love to follow up, maybe in like a follow-up, thank you for coming email, like we can send some links. That's a really good idea. Appreciate that. And I appreciate everybody bearing with me on like a little stats nerding out too. So on the first question, I think this is really challenging. So first, like in the democracy reforms, there was huge, so HR 1 was developed by the House and some progressive members of the House. And as the administration changed and 2021 had this majority that at least all these reforms sort of passed the House very quickly. And then as many national policies have, stagnated in the Senate, where it's been unclear to some extent whether whether Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, whether they really sort of ideologically believe in the filibuster and they don't want to get rid of the filibuster. And that's why these policies won't pass. And another is that they don't want the policies to pass and the filibuster is not really relevant. But they're the 49th and 50th votes. Plus, you know, the vice president breaks a tie in the Senate. So on both the PRO Act, which would remove, so the PRO Act would ban essentially all of the, or almost all of the state-based restrictions on labor unions that have happened since the 1940s and make it so if a majority of workers just signs union cards, the union begins rather than having a drawn out campaign where the firm can really wage a campaign and do pretty sophisticated ways of threatening to either fire or sort of make schedules more difficult for workers who are part of the union push. So both of those would be key, but yeah, I don't think they're likely to pass. And I think in the 2022 midterms, like control of the Senate will change in partisan terms. So what that means is there's two major things that you hear in the punditry, like what should be done about this, you know, in American democracy. One is sort of like, if Democrats change their messaging, like elections will change, right? You know, so if like Joe Biden seems to be wanting to do this. You hear in the State of the Union, if we tack to the center, like Joe Biden's now saying like, no, we don't want to defund the police, we want to fund the police. And that hasn't seemed to shift any sort of like public support for the parties in either way. So messaging would be one bucket that I don't think I think it's very hard through messaging to really in a short term change any election possibilities. The other is a much more long-term sort of organizing campaign, and it's a reinvigoration of grassroots mobilization in terms of elections, but also within the labor movement broadly, as you see in terms of Starbucks and Amazon unionization pushes by young people, organizing on college campuses to increase voter turnout, beyond elections, sort of with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, you're seeing some emergence of sort of peaceful protest movements. There was some kind of, additional peaceful protest movements during the Trump administration and in 2020, all those sorts of tactics, but those don't pay off in immediate terms. They take, when you think about the civil rights movement, that was really decades and decades, and it was not particularly just Selma and Bull Connor's hoses, and next thing you know, Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act. These are long-term investments in political capacity that are really challenging, and it's not a very satisfying answer, but I think that's the reality. Sounds great.
One of the variables that you may have had in that list of 116 variables that you didn't really elaborate upon or mention is religion.
Yeah.
Would church membership be an indicator that one would look at in terms of, my impression is that the more liberal states have lower levels of church membership than the states where we've had the most trouble.
This is such a great question about whether sort of religiosity, church membership plays a role in this. So I would say in terms of the measurement of democracy, I wouldn't particularly want to measure it by saying, saying that church membership is actually part of the concept of democracy. I think potentially like a heavily religious or heavily secular community could both have very functioning democracies, I could imagine in theory. But in practice, you're right that particularly I would say, conservative evangelical church membership is certainly correlated with democratic backsliding over this time period. And there's been some really good social science on understanding the role of, the evangelical movement within opposition to civil rights and the civil rights movement, and more recently, the puzzle of evangelical super support for the Trump administration has been fascinating. If we remember around 2016 when the Access Hollywood tapes came out and things, there's all this discussion, like, this is not very pious, like it didn't appear, right? And yet, evangelicals supported Trump more than other recent Republican candidates. It was really fascinating. And it does seem to suggest that at least in some strands of American white Christianity, there's a deeply and there's some decent history on the Southern Baptist Convention, for example, really organizes around opposition to desegregation of Southern public schools, for example, and the creation of all-white Christian schools. These sorts of things are, do seem to be reappearing. It's not my area of expertise, but Michelle Margolis at the University of Pennsylvania has a nice book on this. And there's she's a quantitative political scientist, but there's a number of historians that look at this too. That's a phenomenal question.
Can anyone hear me? I have a particular question about lobbying. So how do lobbying groups and copycat bills spread across various states at the same time contribute to democratic backsliding?
What an outstanding question.
And for
go for it.
And for clarification, I'm referring to the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC.
Nice. It's great. It's like it's like you read the book very closely. It's great. No, I really appreciate it. I'm going to stop the screen share for now. So the question about sort of interstate lobbying and the American Legislative Exchange Council. And ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, started in the late 70s, early 80s, and has become a really important sort of writer of state legislation. So just for backstory, this is such a critical piece in all of this. So ALEC is one of a number of organizations that are nationally oriented that have really made serious investments in state legislatures over recent decades. So ALEC, what it innovated was understanding, okay, state legislatures are typically heavily amateurish and not very professionalized is the social science way to put it. Washington State's actually remarkably professionalized. It's like a mini Congress, California as well. Then there's others where the legislatures show up like 30 days a year. People retain their side jobs on, their main jobs on corporate boards. They don't have staff to write bills, right? So what ALEC really found out, this was super innovative. And ALEC also connects, so this book, Alex Hertel-Fernandez, State Capture, is like the main social science book on ALEC. This is one of, I think, the country's most important political scientists, the guy, Alex Hertel-Fernandez. But he shows that a couple innovations. One was to connect the parts of the conservative movement within this organization. So it really brought in corporate interests, sort of libertarian gun rights activists and sort of true believer libertarians, and the evangelical movement, and said, listen, we can all kind of partner. So that was one innovation in coordination, where the Democratic Party and I think liberal groups do have struggled to find that level of coordination and organization the same way across environmentalists, racial justice activists, sort of class worker rights types, the feminist movement, these various elements, I think is challenging. But then the other thing was with these amateurish legislatures, sending them bills that they could just tack their names onto, and they don't need lawyers on their staff. Like in Congress, it's really hard to write a bill. Like you have to make sure it's consistent with the past set of policies and jurisprudence and all of this, right? So ALEC really did this. So there started to be ALEC model bills throughout the country, and stand your ground gun laws were one of the major successes of ALEC. But you actually sometimes would see it would still have like the ALEC logo on it, and it would be like in multiple states. It was hilarious. And so that's been really crucial, and that's contributed to the nationalization of state politics, where now state legislatures that used to be these considered backwaters, right? They're now integrated into the national party apparatuses. So now a Wisconsin Republican is like a Michigan Republican, which is like an Alabama Republican, which is like a California Republican. Like they're all part of the national team now, right? Same, it's actually much more true now. It's not as true as on the Republican side, but in the Democratic Party, this is true to a large extent too. It wasn't by ALEC, but groups like MoveOn.org, climate groups, right? Got Democratic state legislatures across the country to coordinate or at least have similar agendas on things like climate, right? So that contributed to the nationalization of state politics, right? Where now our parties are highly nationalized in these national networks of groups, right? But the institutions, like I said, are still heavily decentralized, right? Huge authority for state and local government. So that's a real sort of collision, and it's these national groups that really, plus, national media and the rise of the internet and of cable news and so much more, really nationalized American politics. Great point. Thanks.
Thanks for coming and speaking.
Absolutely.
You mentioned unionization rates as a driver of electoral democracy, which seemed interesting because I tend to associate heightened unionization with heightened economic equality and kind of what you called social democracy.
Right.
And so I wonder if you see a lot of correlation between high levels of social democracy, economic equality, and these other kinds of liberal, liberal democracy and electoral democracy, and vice versa, low rates with other low rates.
You guys are just killing it today. These questions are so good. Question about the relationship between egalitarian democracy and electoral democracy. So first, cross-nationally, you absolutely do see that correlation, a positive correlation. Places that have more economic equality, like within some range. So, it's hard to measure In highly authoritarian regimes, it's hard to measure economic outcomes, but for the most part, you do see like robustness to democratic backsliding and non-backsliding in places that are more economically egalitarian and have larger welfare states and safety nets. That's a correlation you see around the world, but within the US, what's actually quite weird is you don't see that quite as much. There's not as much of a relationship between like unionization through like reducing racial resentment and racial conflict, but not the economic equality part as much. And part of that is because the places that are the most economically unequal in the US are the blue states that have the billionaires. It's really actually an interesting pattern within the US where California is the most economically unequal state. And the Deep South, there's a lot of inequality, but there's not that top end that has quite so much wealth in the top 1%. So you don't see that correlation in the US, but I would say if we look causally, like would increasing economic equality causally improve electoral democracy? I think probably, like, but it's highly, highly uncertain. And to understand like causality here, there's so many other things that go along with economic equality. It's hard. This is like a thing I would suggest, like the scholars in this room, we should try to tackle this issue now where do things like taxation of the super wealthy or, you know, the minimum wage or other things that would reduce material inequality that are outside of sort of the labor movement, like would those improve democratic performance in terms of elections? That's a really provocative, I think probably, but not as established as these other things. Yeah.
So more in the direction of rights and liberties, you touched on Roe v. Wade, and I wanted to ask if you could expand on that in the broader context of how the current status of the 14th Amendment under the current Supreme Court will affect the federal system going forward.
Thanks. So judicial supremacy and judicial review in the US are another unique thing about the US Constitution, right? Other countries don't have Supreme Courts that can sort of set and then remove a precedent or overturn a national law through their parliament, right? They don't have that form of judicial review. And people would say, you know, fundamentally, like Robert Dahl is one of the key sort of democratic theorists in the post-war US, Robert Dahl, like Road Dahl, but Robert. And he, his books really set like how democratic is the US Constitution is one of its fundamental texts. And one of his main things besides saying, you know, the Constitution didn't ban slavery, that was bad, you know, Native peoples, Black people, women couldn't vote, like, but beyond those like really obvious things, like the presence of an unelected Supreme Court that can overturn national law is like the next undemocratic feature. So that's a general thing, but that's been true since judicial review didn't start in the Constitution. It was in Marbury v. Madison, like right in the early 1800s. But since then, there's been this judicial review. So that's one thing, but that's been semi-permanent in US history. The 14th Amendment, though, after the Civil War, the main Reconstruction Amendment, equality under the law, in addition, 13th Amendment bans slavery, 15th Amendment says no racial, you can't prevent people from voting based on race. And that's why Jim Crow laws didn't like explicitly mention race to get around the 15th Amendment. But the 14th Amendment, equality under the law, that would, you know, if that were enforced, it's very true that if that were effectively enforced following Reconstruction, there would be no need for a civil rights movement, no need for the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, right? So non-enforcement of the 14th Amendment is one of the key ongoing sort of issues in American history. And that goes to like, I think one thing is the distance between like norms and behavior and practice and execution and de jure law. So de jure, like the law written as law, right? Where equality under the law is seems pretty clear. Yeah, I don't, besides the fact that, you know, the Supreme Court is trending and will for a long time continue to have these types of sort of narrow interpretations of something like the 14th Amendment may actually, so the 14th Amendment also provided birthright citizenship. Before that, the Dred Scott case said Black Americans can never be citizens, right? And the 14th Amendment said, no, anybody born in the US is a citizen, you know, and then there's naturalization processes for immigrants as well. And, you know, there's some chance that the Supreme Court or a Congress will overturn birthright citizenship through the interpretation of the 14th Amendment. Like that is possible. That wish I had a more pleasant way to close that one off.
Thanks so much. It was such an interesting talk. I really appreciated it. I wanted to ask a question about this idea that Republican control is the kind of real marker of whether or not we see Democratic backsliding. And I wondered about that temporally.
Yeah.
So like, is that always the case? Because you're looking at it over time, and it's not as if Republicans just took over in many states. So is it specific to a particular kind of change in ideology in terms of the Republican Party? Or is that kind of continuous? Do you see that?
Amazing question. So is the Republican Party consistently, if I had done this before the year 2000, right, what would the relationships look like in terms of partisanship? And no, so, I mean, you know, on average, the longer term gerrymanderers, for example, and voter suppressors was the Democratic Party for most of the 20th century in the US South specifically. But it's a really interesting, the US party system change in the 20th century is really, really crucial here, where it wasn't 1964 like Goldwater v. LBJ and the Civil Rights Act. It started much earlier. The sort of transformation of the party starts in the 1930s, where Northern Democrats are pressured by great migration, Black Americans moving to northern cities where they do now have voting rights outside of the Jim Crow South. So they're now voting in Detroit, Chicago, Seattle, with Boeing and, you know, in the World War II buildup, right? All these great, Oakland, all these great migration cities in northern states, they have voting rights now, plus labor unions at the time. They're pressuring these northern urban Democrats to fuse their sort of economic progressive New Deal beliefs with racial justice and civil rights. And that fuses them into like racial and economic justice, like being in a single package, right? And a lot of majority white unions are doing this too, like the CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations. So Eric Schickler's book, Racial Realignment, is really great on this. So starting in the 30s, this is a long-term process, but the Northern Democrats are the most racially and economically progressive in the country of any party group of all time. And the Southern Democrats are the most, you know, opposed to civil rights and democracy of anyone. So the Democratic Party is the most high variance or heterogeneous party, right, in US history, or really global. Like, it's remarkable how that survived so long. But then over the long term, the South then resorts to the Republican Party, and the parties really nationalize, where now we're in a moment technologically, in terms of media, in terms of culture, in terms of like money in politics and lobbying groups and all of this. There's no way to go back to a decentralized party system. There's no way to hold together a party that has such different beliefs about democracy, right? So that's no longer going to happen. But I would say the Democrats through the 20th century had simultaneously the most sort of pro-democracy, the most anti-democracy individuals within it. But absolutely, the Republican Party transformation has been long-term, but really kicked up many notches recently. And I think it's, so Dan Ziblatt, who I mentioned in How Democracies Die, his co-authored book, his original book is about nationally what conservative parties do in countries around the world, and thinking about what do mainstream conservative parties that want to be in democracies but tend to be the parties of business and the wealthy, what did they do when democracy was backsliding in Germany in the 1930s, in Italy, in countries that experienced these backslides from democracy? And he says conservative parties are the sort of bellwether, they're the pivot in democratic systems. They have the wealthy who know from the jump. In most societies, feudal societies, right, it's the wealthy and then a bunch of serfs. And democracy gives the serfs a bunch of votes now. And they can take away the wealth of the landed gentry. Like, that's classic how democracy works. So the landed gentry says, okay, I'm gonna make this bargain. We'll do some democracy so I won't be revolted against, and I'll have to redistribute some of my power, right? That's how, so conservative parties of those, you know, have this dilemma here, he argues, And what he says is there's always this temptation for a conservative party when they're losing because their economic platform is not going to be very effective to win votes, especially in times of economic inequality, right? It's not very, you know, you see this, like, it's not like Republicans are going out there being like, our top issue, cutting taxes on billionaires. That's not what they say. It's not very popular. So conservative parties have an incentive to introduce other forms of conflict in society and win votes on that basis. Religious conflict, gender-based sort of traditional values-based conflict, right? Immigration-based conflict, nationalism and war, right? These are other things you can win votes on and are popular in the public. Like the US public is not very supportive of immigration. Like we need to be real about that. Like the median voter nationally is not. They are more pro-choice, like majorities really do support abortion rights, but not on things like immigration and to some forms of racial justice, they're not. And that's why it's advantageous for conservative parties to do this. But you can go so far as to say, listen, to avoid redistributing our power and so forth, we're going to introduce so much of that conflict into society that democracy will fall away, right? And that's the key dilemma we're facing now in an era of economic inequality and an era where, you know, masses of voters get to decide sort of which type of, are we going to pursue this ongoing democratic sort of compromise, or are we going to reject democracy?
We have one more audience question, then maybe we can.
Sure.
Yeah, I just had, I might have misheard you, but were you saying that you think that there's a real chance of the 14th Amendment, birthright citizenship being retracted somehow? And I guess if you were saying that, how would that occur when the 14th Amendment explicitly says all people born are citizens if they're born within the United States?
Yeah, no, so I think there's increased like legal theorization. Like if you look at, so the Federalist Society, for example, which set much of the federal judiciary at this point, there's a huge number of legal arguments and papers now saying that actually it's consistent with the 14th Amendment, or a constitutional convention could do that, or a new constitutional amendment should, like a Republican majority in Congress, be large enough. So I wouldn't say it's a large, you know, I think absolutely like the most probable outcome is like a lot more muddling through of very big differences across states in their democratic performance, increasing like counter majoritarianism in American democracy. But I would say, yeah, I would give that the prospect of that happening in the next 20 years, like a 10% chance.
We have some questions.
Sure,
from the
thanks.
online audience. One asks, given the rise of information bubbles, the popularity of right-wing media and claims of fake news, do you see us having the ability to regain political spaces?
Thanks. So the question was about sort of fake news, maybe a little about social media misinformation. Was that in that question as well? And yeah, how does that affect our ability to get out of the democratic crisis? So I would say the social science research is actually really interesting here, where the perceptions and sort of pundit stuff about social media kind of overstates it, how tough it is for democracy. Social media and misinformation specifically out there in social media is not as big of a threat to democracy as the sort of issues we've known about for a longer time. So for example, in terms of people's ordinary Americans' attitudes towards democratic institutions and their voting behavior, like viewing Fox News is so much more consequential than social media sort of misinformation or propaganda or social media effects in general. I would say the biggest threat that social media does do, though, it did really nationalize politics again in this way. And I think the bigger thing, rather even than misinformation, is actually social media provides these new abilities and incentives for a party or a group to find any noxious member of the other group and like put a spotlight on it and talk trash about it and rile up your side and say like, look at this really extreme example of what we dislike, you know? So that's actually probably more important than, you know, sort of like the Russia stuff and like all the misinformation based stuff. I would say like, it's just, it's become so cliche, but the effect of watching Fox News, and they did this really clever ways to study the effect of Fox News, because you can't just say, oh, the people who watch Fox News are different than the people who don't, right? They're different in all sorts of ways. But what they did was they exploited differences in the channel ordering. So this is a paper by Greg Martin and a co-author. He's really outstanding. And what they did was they looked at variation in the channel order of if Fox News is a lower channel number, you're more likely to flip through it and stop for a second on it. So they exploited that difference across places and the rollout of Fox News in channel by channel in the 90s. And they did that to estimate the causal effect of Fox News. And it's a big deal. And there's a new study that just came out by David Brockman and Josh Kalla. It's really important, where they raised $1 bajillion in grants, and they paid huge Fox News watchers to watch CNN instead. You know, CNN, not an amazing channel, but they did this for they said 3 weeks, you get a substantial amount of money if you we're gonna change your cable system so you can't watch Fox News and you have to watch CNN anytime you want to go to Fox News. And it didn't move people, it didn't totally transform them, but it really did about their extent of believing the stop the steal stuff and all that. It was actually quite remarkable. So it's cliche at this point, but that is a huge deal, and it's a much bigger deal than anything on the internet.
Okay, this one is from the beforehand questions. I'm running for a congressional office in Florida against a pro-Trump incumbent. What do you think is the most critical and simple message we can use to make voters understand the danger our democracy is in? Great question. So question about what message would inspire voters to want to protect democracy. I would say one unfortunate thing is that you guys are a very biased subsample of Americans who care about democratic institutions. And for most people, any institutions or rules or procedures, they're just cover you for the actual outcomes you want, right? When you hear somebody say, oh, I just believe in states' rights, you kind of know what that means. There's something under that. And the same thing for most of it, I think it's true for me too. We really, maybe I want, I really like democracy, but it's because I like what democracy produces, I think, right? And I think that's true for most people. So the really unfortunate thing is polling suggests that outside of Black voters, especially civil rights era, older Black voters, not many people are really voting on the basis of voting rights, for example, right? That's not the most mobilizing thing. People are more mobilized by the ordinary economic and social policies we talk about, including overturning Roe v. Wade may be a big deal in that way. It remains to be seen, but that plus economic outcomes plus, issues of race and racial conflict, cultural conflict, those are a bigger deal. And that's unfortunate, but that seems to be the case. And now there's a huge debate around the world. Does public support for democratic institutions, is that what's driving whether states or whether countries are changing their democracies or backsliding? And there's a really ongoing debate right now in poli-sci about that. And I would say the answer is not clear.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Let's see, is this working?
Yeah.
I hate to wrap up what has been a fantastic, robust conversation. I think it's a testament to Jake's command of a really critical question in our politics today, as well as really fantastic questions from the audience. So all the best. May the conversation continue. I welcome political science students, faculty interested, political science interested folks to join us down at Boundary Bay a little bit later this evening for our annual reception. Hope to see you there.
Thank you, guys.